The bullet that grazed Patrick Quinn's shoulder in the spring of 1876 should have killed him, but death had learned long ago that he was not an easy man to claim. He stood in the dusty main street of Valentine, Nebraska, watching three men ride away with stolen cattle that did not belong to them. Their laughter carried back on the hot wind as he pressed his hand against the bleeding wound, and felt nothing but the familiar cold emptiness that had lived in his chest since Shiloh. Patrick was 32 years old and looked older, with lines carved deep around his pale blue eyes and a scar that ran from his left temple down to his jaw. He had killed his first man at 19 during the war, and the tally had grown since then, in ways both legal and necessary. He worked as a ranch hand now, drifting from one spread to another across Nebraska and Wyoming, never staying long enough for anyone to ask too many questions about the haunted look in his eyes, or the way his hand never strayed far from the Colt revolver on his hip. Doc Harrington stitched him up in the back room of the general store, whistling tunelessly between his teeth as Patrick sat perfectly still without whiskey or laudanum to dull the pain. He had learned to welcome pain. It was the only thing that reminded him he was still alive. "You should report this to the sheriff," Doc Harrington said, tying off the last stitch with practiced efficiency. "Those rustlers are getting bolder." Patrick pulled on his shirt, the fabric sticking to the blood that had not yet dried. "Sheriff does not pay my wages. Neither does getting shot." Patrick laid $2 silver on the table and walked out into the afternoon heat, squinting against the brightness of the sun. Valentine was a small town, barely more than a wide spot in the road with a general store, a saloon, a church that had seen better days, and a handful of other buildings that served the ranchers and farmers scattered across the surrounding prairie. It was exactly the kind of place where a man could disappear if he wanted to, and Patrick Quinn very much wanted to disappear. He was heading toward the livery stable where he kept his horse when he heard the commotion coming from outside the general store. A woman's voice, clear and firm despite the tremor of fear running underneath, cut through the lazy afternoon air. "I have already told you, Mr. Sampson, that I will pay you as soon as I am able. My father's estate is still being settled." Patrick should have kept walking. He should have saddled his horse and ridden back to the Double R Ranch where he had been working for the past 2 months. He should have remembered that getting involved in other people's problems only ever led to more trouble. But something in that voice made him stop and turn around. The woman standing on the boardwalk outside the general store was small and dark-haired, dressed in a simple gray dress that had been carefully mended in several places. She held a basket of supplies against her hip and faced down a large man in a suit that was too fine for Valentine. 2 other men flanked him, their hands resting casually on their gun belts in a way that suggested they were more than just companions. "Your father's been dead 3 months, Miss Zimmerman," the man in the suit said, his voice carrying the oily smoothness of someone who enjoyed having power over others. "I have been more than patient about the money he owed me, but patience has its limits." "I understand that, Mr. Sampson, but I cannot pay you what I do not have. The farm barely produces enough to feed myself and my sister. Give me until the harvest and I will pay you every cent with interest." Sampson stepped closer, and Patrick saw the woman's knuckles go white around the basket handle. "The harvest is months away. I want my money now, or perhaps we can work out another arrangement." The implication in his words hung heavy in the air, and Patrick felt something stir in the cold emptiness of his chest. It was a foreign sensation, one he had not experienced in so long that it took him a moment to recognize it as anger. He stepped off the street and onto the boardwalk, his boots echoing on the weathered wood. "The lady said she will pay you at harvest." 4 sets of eyes turned toward him. Sampson's face registered annoyance, then calculation as he took in Patrick's worn clothing, the bandage visible beneath his partially buttoned shirt, and the gun on his hip that showed the kind of wear that came from regular use. "This is a private conversation," Sampson said. "It stopped being private when you had it on a public street." Patrick looked at the woman for the first time, really looked at her, and felt something crack in the ice that surrounded his heart. She had dark brown eyes that were wide with fear but also bright with determination, and there was a smudge of flour on her cheek that somehow made her look both vulnerable and fierce at the same time. "Who are you?" Sampson demanded. "Patrick Quinn." He did not offer his hand. "And you are harassing this lady." One of Sampson's men shifted his weight, his hand moving closer to his gun. Patrick's eyes flicked toward him, and whatever the man saw in that cold blue gaze made him freeze. "I am conducting legitimate business," Sampson said, but he took a step back. "Miss Zimmerman's father owed me $500. That debt does not disappear just because he is dead." "And she said she will pay you at harvest," Patrick repeated. "Seems like a fair offer to me. And who are you to judge what is fair?" "Some drifter cowhand who probably does not have $5 to his name." Sampson's voice rose with indignation. "I have already been generous by waiting this long. If she cannot pay, then I will take the farm as payment. That is fair." The woman, Miss Zimmerman, made a small sound of distress. "That farm is all my sister and I have. You cannot take our home. I can and I will, unless you pay me what is owed." Sampson turned his attention back to Patrick. "And you would be wise to stay out of matters that do not concern you." Patrick stepped closer, closing the distance between them until he could smell the pomade in Sampson's hair and the whiskey on his breath. When he spoke, his voice was quiet and flat, carrying the weight of all the violence he had seen and caused. "Leave. Now." For a long moment, Sampson held his ground, his face flushing red with anger and humiliation. Then he looked into Patrick's eyes again, and whatever he saw there convinced him. He jerked his head toward his men and stepped off the boardwalk. "This is not over, Miss Zimmerman," he called back over his shoulder. "You have until the end of the week to come up with the money, or I will take the farm." He pointed a finger at Patrick. "And you just made yourself an enemy you cannot afford." Patrick watched them walk away, 3 men in expensive clothes who made their living by squeezing money out of people who had none to give. When they turned the corner, he finally looked back at the woman on the boardwalk. "Thank you," she said quietly. "You did not have to do that." "No, I did not." Patrick touched the brim of his hat. "You should get off the street, Miss Zimmerman. Men like that do not take kindly to being embarrassed. Wait." She stepped forward, clutching her basket. "You are hurt. Your shoulder is bleeding through your shirt." Patrick glanced down and saw fresh blood seeping through the fabric. The confrontation had pulled some of Doc Harrington's stitches. "It is nothing." "It is not nothing. Please, let me at least check the wound. It is the least I can do after you helped me." When he hesitated, she added, "I have some skill with nursing. My mother was a midwife, and she taught me before she passed." Against his better judgment, Patrick found himself following her around the side of the general store to where a small wagon hitched to an old mare waited in the shade. Miss Zimmerman set down her basket and motioned for him to sit on the back of the wagon. "May I?" she asked, gesturing toward his shirt. When he nodded, she carefully unbuttoned it and eased the fabric away from the bandage. Her touch was gentle but efficient, and Patrick found himself watching her face as she worked. Up close, he could see the shadows of exhaustion under her eyes and the way her dress hung a little loose on her frame, as though she had recently lost weight. "The stitches have torn," she said, frowning. "You should not have gotten into a confrontation so soon after being injured. How did this happen?" Rustlers shot me this morning while I was moving cattle." Her hands stilled for a moment, and she looked up at him with something like understanding in her dark eyes. "And yet you still stopped to help me. That was foolish." "Yes," Patrick agreed. "It was." Something that might have been a smile flickered across her face there and gone so quickly he almost missed it. She pulled a clean cloth from her basket and pressed it against the wound to stop the fresh bleeding. "My name is Nora Zimmerman. That man, Mr. Sampson, was telling the truth about my father's debt. He borrowed money to buy seed last spring, and then he died before the crops came in. My sister and I have been trying to keep the farm going, but it is hard with just the two of us." "What about neighbors? Someone to help with the heavy work?" Nora shook her head, her dark hair catching the light. "The nearest farm is 5 miles away, and they have their own struggles. Everyone does out here. We manage as best we can, but Sampson knows we are vulnerable. He has been circling like a vulture, waiting for an excuse to take the land. I think he wants it for himself, though I cannot imagine why. It is not much, just 80 acres of stubborn prairie and a cabin that leaks when it rains." Patrick was quiet for a moment, watching her capable hands work. "You have until the end of the week," he said. "Yes, 3 days." Nora tied off the makeshift bandage and stepped back. "You should have Doc Harrington put in fresh stitches. This will hold for now, but you need proper care." "I will." Patrick stood and buttoned his shirt, wincing slightly at the pull of the wound. "Where is your farm?" 5 miles south of town, near Plum Creek. Why, he should not have asked. He should have tipped his hat and walked away and forgotten all about Nora Zimmerman and her problems. But when he looked at her standing there in the shade of the general store, her chin lifted with stubborn pride despite the fear in her eyes, he heard himself say, "I could help you with the farm work, until harvest." Nora's eyes widened. "I cannot pay you. I do not have any money. Room and board would be enough, and it would only be until harvest to help you get the crops in. After that, you can sell enough to pay off Sampson and have something left over for winter." "Why would you do this? You do not know me." Patrick did not have a good answer for that. He did not understand it himself, this sudden impulse to help a stranger, to get involved in someone else's life when he had spent years carefully avoiding exactly that. But there was something about Nora Zimmerman that had cracked through the ice around his heart, and he found that he could not quite walk away. "Because Sampson is a vulture," he said finally, "and I do not like vultures." Nora studied his face for a long moment, and Patrick had the uncomfortable feeling that she could see right through him, past the scars and the coldness to whatever small piece of humanity still remained. Then she nodded slowly. "All right. But I insist on feeding you properly, and you will have the spare room in the cabin. And if you change your mind, you are free to leave at any time." "Fair enough." They shook hands, and Patrick felt the calluses on her palm, the roughness of someone who worked hard and did not complain about it. Her hand was small in his, warm and alive, and he held it for just a moment longer than necessary before letting go. The ride out to Nora's farm took them through rolling prairie dotted with wildflowers and the occasional stand of cottonwoods. The sun was starting its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and amber. Patrick rode his horse alongside Nora's wagon, and she pointed out landmarks as they traveled a lightning-struck tree where her father had once seen a mountain lion, a bend in the creek where the fishing was good, a hill where wildflowers bloomed so thick in spring that it looked like a purple blanket had been thrown over the land. She talked easily, as though they had known each other for years rather than hours, and Patrick found himself listening with an attention he usually reserved for the sound of approaching danger. Her voice was soothing, and the way she described the land showed a deep love for it despite all the hardship it brought. "My father moved us here from Ohio 7 years ago," she said as they topped a rise and the farm came into view. "My mother did not want to come, but he dreamed of having his own land. He said that out here, a man could be whatever he wanted to be, that the prairie did not care about your past or your mistakes." Patrick looked at the small cabin and barn below, the field stretching out behind them with young corn plants standing in neat rows. Was he right? Nora was quiet for a moment. I think he believed he was, and maybe that is all that matters in the end. As they drew closer, Patrick saw a young woman emerge from the cabin, shading her eyes against the setting sun. She was younger than Nora, perhaps 19 or 20, with the same dark hair but a rounder face and a more carefree way of moving. "That is my sister, Sarah," Nora said. "She is going to be full of questions about you." She was right. Sarah met them in the yard with curiosity bright in her eyes, looking Patrick up and down with the frank assessment of someone too young to have learned to hide her thoughts. "Who is this?" Sarah asked, directing the question at Nora but keeping her eyes on Patrick. "This is Patrick Quinn. He is going to be helping us with the farm work until harvest." Nora climbed down from the wagon and began unloading supplies. "Patrick, this is my sister Sarah. Helping us." Sarah's eyebrows rose. "We cannot afford to hire help." "He is working for room and board," Nora said firmly, in a tone that suggested the matter was not up for discussion. "He will be staying in the spare room." Sarah looked between them, clearly bursting with more questions, but something in Nora's expression made her swallow them down. Instead, she turned to Patrick with a smile that was equal parts welcoming and wary. "Well then, welcome to our farm, Mr. Quinn. I hope you like beans, because that is what we are having for supper." The cabin was small but clean, with 2 bedrooms, a main room that served as kitchen and living area, and a loft where Sarah slept. The spare room had been their father's, Nora explained, and it still held his few possessions: a change of clothes, a worn Bible, a pipe he had never smoked in front of his daughters. Patrick set his bedroll on the narrow bed and stood for a moment in the doorway, feeling like an intruder in this space that still held the ghost of the man who had built it. He had lived alone for so long that the thought of sharing a home with 2 women, of sitting down to family dinners and making small talk, felt stranger than any gunfight he had been in. But when Nora called him to supper, he found himself sitting at the rough wooden table while Sarah ladled beans and cornbread onto tin plates. The food was simple but good, seasoned with herbs from the garden Nora tended behind the cabin. They ate in relative silence at first, the only sounds the clink of spoons against plates and the evening breeze rustling through the open window. Then Sarah, unable to contain her curiosity any longer, blurted out, "How did you and Nora meet?" Patrick glanced at Nora, who gave him a small nod as if to say he could tell the story or not as he chose. "I saw Mr. Sampson bothering your sister in town and intervened." Sarah's face darkened. "That man is a snake. He has been sniffing around here ever since Papa died, pretending to be concerned about us but really just waiting for his chance to take the farm." "Sarah," Nora said quietly. "Well, it is true. You know it is. He does not care about the money. He wants the land because it has the best water access in the area, and he thinks 2 women alone cannot do anything to stop him." Sarah turned her fierce gaze back to Patrick. "So why did you help? Most men in Valentine do not want to cross Sampson." "I do not care about Sampson," Patrick said simply. "But you care enough to work our farm for free." "Sarah, that is enough," Nora said, her voice taking on a sharper edge. "Mr. Quinn is being generous and we should be grateful, not interrogate him." Sarah subsided, but Patrick could see the worry in her eyes. the fear that came from knowing their survival hung by a thread and one strong wind could break it. He understood that fear. He had lived with it for years, though his was a different kind, the fear that one day the coldness inside him would spread until there was nothing left but ice and emptiness. After supper, Nora walked with him out to the barn to show him where the tools were kept and explain what needed doing. The sun had set, and stars were beginning to emerge in the darkening sky, so many of them that they looked like someone had scattered diamonds across black velvet. "I apologize for Sarah," Nora said as they stood in the barn doorway. "She is protective, and she has reason to be. Life has not been kind to us lately. No apology needed. She is right to be wary of strangers." Nora turned to look at him, her face half in shadow. "Are you dangerous, Patrick Quinn?" It was a direct question, and it deserved a direct answer. "Yes. Will you hurt us?" "No." She studied him for a long moment, and Patrick forced himself not to look away. He wanted her to see him clearly, to understand exactly what kind of man she had invited into her home. But instead of fear, he saw something else in her eyes, understanding, perhaps, or recognition. "My father used to say that the most dangerous men are often the most gentle ones, because they know the cost of violence," she said quietly. "He fought in the war, same as many men out here. He never talked about it, but sometimes I would hear him at night, pacing the floor or crying out from nightmares. My mother said the war took something from him that he never got back." Patrick felt his chest tighten. What did he die of? His heart just stopped one day while he was plowing the field. The doctor said it was probably weak from illness he contracted during the war. But I think he was just tired. Tired of fighting to make the land yield, tired of being poor, tired of carrying whatever he saw in the war. She wrapped her arms around herself. "I am telling you this because I want you to know that I understand. Whatever made you the way you are, whatever put that look in your eyes, I am not going to pry. You are entitled to your past." "Thank you," Patrick said, and meant it. They stood in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the night sounds, crickets chirping, the rustle of mice in the hay, the occasional whinny from his horse in the corral. Patrick felt something unfamiliar settling over him, a sense of peace he had not experienced since before the war. It scared him more than any gunfight ever had. Over the next 3 days, Patrick threw himself into the farm work with a single-minded intensity that left little room for thought. He repaired the leaky roof on the cabin, replaced broken fence posts, plowed new furrows for a late planting of beans, and helped Nora tend the corn that was already knee-high and growing strong. The work was hard and honest, and his shoulder protested every movement, but he welcomed the physical exhaustion. Nora worked beside him, matching him hour for hour in the fields despite the heat that pressed down like a weight. She never complained, never asked for special treatment, and Patrick found himself developing a deep respect for her determination. Sarah helped when she could, but she also had to manage the chickens and the vegetable garden and the endless household chores that kept them fed and clothed. On the 3rd evening, as Patrick was washing up at the pump behind the cabin, he heard the sound of horses approaching. He dried his hands and walked around to the front, arriving just as 3 riders came into view, Sampson and his 2 men. Patrick felt the familiar coldness settle over him, the detachment that came before violence. He stepped off the porch and stood in the yard, his hand hanging loose near his gun. Sampson reined in his horse and looked down at Patrick with barely concealed anger. "You are still here." "I am. I told you to stay out of this, and I am not good at following instructions." Nora came out of the cabin, wiping her hands on her apron. Sarah appeared behind her, and Patrick heard the distinct sound of a rifle being cocked. He glanced back and saw Sarah standing in the doorway with an old Henry rifle pointed at the riders. "Get off my land, Mr. Sampson," Nora said clearly. "You have no business here." "I have every business here. Your deadline has passed, Miss Zimmerman. You owe me $500 and I have come to collect." Sampson pulled a folded paper from his coat pocket. "This is a writ of seizure signed by Judge Thompson. If you cannot pay, the farm is mine." Patrick saw Nora go pale, saw her hands clench into fists at her sides. He stepped forward. "How much is Judge Thompson in your pocket, Sampson? What did it cost you to get him to sign that?" Sampson's face flushed. "My business arrangements are none of your concern. This is all legal and proper." "Legal maybe. Proper is another matter." Patrick kept his voice calm and level. "But it does not matter because Miss Zimmerman is going to pay you." "With what?" Sampson laughed. "I have had men watching this place. You have been working the farm, but that does not put money in her pocket. She does not have $500. She probably does not have $5. "I do," Patrick said. The words surprised him almost as much as they surprised everyone else. He had not planned to say them, had not even consciously made the decision. But as soon as they left his mouth, he knew they were true. "You," Sampson's laugh was derisive. "A drifting cowhand." Patrick walked to the barn without answering. His saddlebags were hanging on a nail just inside the door, and he reached into the hidden pocket in the lining where he kept the money he had saved over the years. Money he had never spent because he had never had anything to spend it on. Nothing he wanted badly enough to trade the security of having it. He pulled out a thick roll of bills and coins and walked back to where Sampson sat on his horse, counting out $500 with slow deliberation. When he was done, he held it up. "That is the debt, paid in full." Sampson stared at the money, and Patrick saw the calculations running behind his eyes. He clearly had not expected this, had been so certain the farm would be his that he had not prepared for any other outcome. "Where did you get that kind of money?" Sampson demanded. "That is none of your business. The debt is paid. Now get off this land and do not come back." For a moment, Patrick thought Sampson might refuse, might try to find some other angle to work. Then one of his men shifted nervously in his saddle, glancing at the rifle Sarah still held trained on them and the cold look in Patrick's eyes. He leaned over and whispered something to Sampson. Sampson snatched the money from Patrick's hand. "This is not over. I will find another way." "No," Patrick said quietly. "It is over. If I see you on this property again, if I hear that you have threatened these women in any way, I will kill you. Do you understand me?" The flatness in his voice, the complete absence of bluster or emotion, made it clear he was not making an empty threat. Sampson's face went white, then red, and he jerked his horse's head around viciously. The three men rode away at a canter, dust rising behind them in the twilight. Patrick stood in the yard until they were out of sight, feeling the adrenaline slowly drain away and leave him shaking. Behind him, he heard Sarah lower the rifle and Nora's footsteps on the porch. "Patrick," Nora said, and her voice was thick with emotion. "You did not have to do that." He turned to face her, and the look on her face nearly undid him. There were tears in her eyes, and she held one hand pressed to her mouth as though trying to contain everything she was feeling. "That was your money," she continued. "Probably everything you had saved. Why would you do that for us?" Patrick did not have a good answer. He had asked himself the same question as he counted out the bills, and the only answer he could come up with was so terrifying in its implications that he could barely acknowledge it. "I will work it off," he said instead. "Room and board is not enough to cover $500. I will stay until the debt is repaid." "That could take years," Nora protested. "Then it takes years." She shook her head, tears spilling over. "I do not understand you, Patrick Quinn. You are either the kindest man I have ever met or the most foolish." Probably both, he admitted. Sarah whooped from the doorway, breaking the tension. We get to keep the farm. We are not going to be homeless. She ran down the steps and threw her arms around Patrick in an impulsive hug that made him stiffen in surprise. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Patrick awkwardly patted her shoulder, completely unprepared for such an open display of affection. When Sarah finally let go, she was grinning through her own tears, and Patrick felt something warm unfurl in his chest, melting a little more of the ice. That night, after a celebratory supper where Sarah talked a mile a minute and Nora kept looking at Patrick with an expression he could not quite decipher, Patrick sat on the porch and watched the stars wheel overhead. He heard the door open and close softly, and then Nora settled onto the step beside him, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders against the cool night air. They sat in silence for a while, and Patrick was grateful that she did not feel the need to fill every moment with words. But eventually she spoke. Sarah is right, you know. You are either very kind or very foolish. I have not decided which yet. You will let me know when you figure it out, he heard the smile in her voice. I will, though I suspect the answer is that you are both in equal measure. She paused. Patrick, I know you said I should not pry into your past, and I will honor that. But I want you to know that whatever you are running from, whatever made you into the man who can threaten to kill someone with such chilling sincerity, you are not that person here. Here, you are just Patrick, who fixes our roof and saves our farm and makes my sister laugh for the first time in months. Patrick felt his throat tighten. I am not a good man, Nora. I think you are wrong about that. I think you are a better man than you give yourself credit for. You have just forgotten how to see it. He turned to look at her, and in the starlight her face was soft and open, without any of the wariness most people showed him. She looked at him as though he was someone worth looking at, someone worth saving, and Patrick felt the ice around his heart crack a little more. I have done things, he said roughly. Things I cannot take back, things that would make you send me away if you knew. We have all done things we regret. That is part of being human. What matters is what we do now, who we choose to be going forward. She reached out and took his hand, her fingers threading through his, warm and alive and real. Stay, Patrick, not because you owe us money, but because you want to. Because maybe here, on this little farm in the middle of nowhere, you can find something you lost. Patrick looked down at their joined hands, and for the first time in 14 years, he allowed himself to hope. I do not know if I remember how to be anything other than what I am. Then we will figure it out together, Nora said simply. The weeks that followed fell into a comfortable rhythm. Patrick woke before dawn to do the morning chores, feeding the animals and milking the cow and hauling water from the well. Nora would have breakfast ready when he came in, and they would eat together while planning the day's work. Sarah would tease him mercilessly about his serious demeanor, trying to make him smile, and occasionally she would succeed. The corn grew tall and strong, and Patrick helped Nora plant a late crop of squash and beans between the rows. They worked side by side in the fields, and slowly, Patrick found himself talking to her in ways he had not talked to anyone in years. He told her about growing up in Missouri, about learning to ride and shoot from his father, who had been a lawman. He told her about joining the Union Army at 18, full of idealistic notions about honor and duty. He did not tell her about Shiloh, about the 2 days of slaughter that had killed most of his company and all of his innocents. He did not tell her about the things he had done after the war, the men he had killed in dusty streets and dark alleys. But he thought she understood anyway, that she could read between the lines of what he said and see the shape of his ghosts. Nora told him about her own life, about growing up in Ohio in a house that always felt too small, about her mother's death from pneumonia 2 winters ago. about how hard her father had worked to make something of the farm only to die before he could see it truly prosper. She talked about Sarah, who was supposed to be engaged to a boy back in Ohio but had broken it off when their father moved them west, much to everyone's scandal. She says she wants to marry for love, not convenience, Nora said one afternoon as they rested in the shade of the barn, drinking cool water from the well. I admire her for that. I married once when I was 19 to a man my father approved of. He died of cholera 6 months later and I barely knew him. It felt like grieving a stranger. Patrick had not known she was a widow. The knowledge settled something in him, some concern he had not wanted to examine too closely. You want to marry again, someday perhaps. If I found someone who saw me as a partner rather than property, someone who could love this land the way I do, who understood that it is hard and unforgiving but also beautiful and worth fighting for. She turned to look at him, and there was something in her eyes that made his heart beat faster. What about you? Have you ever wanted a family? Once, Patrick admitted. Before the war. There was a girl back home and we talked about getting married when I came back. But I was gone 4 years and by the time I returned she had married someone else. I do not blame her. The boy who left was not the man who came back. And since then, I have been too busy surviving to think about living. Nora reached out and touched his hand, just a brief press of her fingers against his. Maybe it is time to think about living again. As summer deepened, Patrick found the walls around his heart crumbling piece by piece. It happened in small moments: Sarah's laughter when he told a rare joke, the quiet satisfaction of a hard day's work well done, the way Nora's eyes lit up when the corn tassels began to appear. It happened in the evenings on the porch, sitting beside Nora and watching the sunset paint the prairie in impossible colors. It happened when he woke in the morning and remembered where he was and felt something like contentment instead of the usual hollow ache. He was falling in love with Nora Zimmerman and it terrified him. Love made you vulnerable. Love gave you something to lose. Love was the thing he had been running from for 14 years, because loving meant eventually losing, and he had already lost so much. But Nora had a way of slipping past his defenses as though they did not exist. She never pushed, never demanded, but her steady presence wore away at his resistance like water on stone. She talked to him about everything and nothing. She asked his opinion on matters large and small. She sang while she worked in the garden, off-key and unself-conscious, and the sound made him smile without meaning to. One evening in late July, a thunderstorm rolled across the prairie with the kind of violence that reminded Patrick why people respected the plains. Lightning split the sky and thunder shook the cabin walls, and rain fell in sheets so thick that Patrick could barely see the barn from the porch. He stood in the doorway watching it, and Nora came to stand beside him. "I love storms," she said, raising her voice to be heard over the rain. "They scare Sarah, but I have always found them beautiful. All that power and fury, and then it passes and leaves everything clean and new." Patrick thought about his own storms, the ones that lived inside him, and wondered if they could ever pass and leave him clean. "I am not sure some things can be washed away." "No," Nora agreed, "but they can be forgiven, by others and by ourselves." She looked up at him then, and the expression on her face was so open and tender that Patrick forgot how to breathe. Without thinking, without planning, he reached out and touched her cheek, and she leaned into his hand with a small sigh. "Nora," he said, and her name felt like a prayer in his mouth. "Yes, I am falling in love with you, and I do not know how to stop." "Then do not stop," she whispered. "I am falling in love with you too." Patrick pulled her into his arms, and she came willingly, fitting against him as though she had been made to be there. He held her while the storm raged around them, feeling the warmth of her body and the steady beat of her heart. And for the first time since Shiloh, he allowed himself to believe that maybe he could have this. Maybe he could be the kind of man who deserved someone like Nora Zimmerman. When the storm passed and the stars emerged one by one in the scrubbed, clean sky, Patrick kissed her. It was gentle and tentative, a question more than a demand, and when she kissed him back, he felt the last of the ice around his heart shatter into 1,000 glittering pieces. From that night on, things changed between them in ways both subtle and profound. They were more careful in front of Sarah, not wanting to flaunt their relationship, but the girl was perceptive and made teasing comments that left Nora blushing and Patrick feeling oddly pleased. He had never imagined himself as part of a family, but that was what this was becoming, and he found he wanted it more than he had wanted anything in a very long time. The corn grew tall and golden, and Patrick and Nora walked between the rows in the evening, talking about plans for next year's planting, about building a new chicken coop, about all the small, mundane details of a life lived together. He told her more about his past, about the men he had killed and the reasons why, and she listened without judgment, her hand steady in his. "I am not that man anymore," Patrick said one evening as they sat by Plum Creek, dangling their feet in the cool water. "Or at least, I do not want to be. Being here with you and Sarah, working this land, it has made me remember that there is more to life than just surviving." "You are not that man anymore," Nora agreed. "You are the man who saves farms and fixes roofs and tells terrible jokes that make my sister laugh. You are the man I love, Patrick Quinn." He turned to her, seeing the truth of it in her eyes, and felt something settle in his chest, something that felt like peace. "Will you marry me, Nora? I do not have much to offer except a pair of willing hands and a heart that has been yours since the day I saw you standing up to Samson outside the general store. But if you will have me, I swear I will spend every day of my life trying to deserve you." Tears spilled down Nora's cheeks, but she was smiling. "Yes, yes, of course I will marry you. I have been yours since the day you gave up everything you had to save my home. I have been yours since you looked at me with those sad, cold eyes, and I saw the good man hidden underneath all that hurt." Patrick kissed her then, soft and deep and full of promise, and somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark sang its evening song. They were married in September, after the harvest was in and the crops sold for a profit that was modest but real. The ceremony took place in the small church in Valentine, with Sarah as witness and a handful of neighbors and townspeople in attendance. Patrick wore new clothes that Nora had made for him, and she wore a simple dress of pale blue that brought out the color of her eyes. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Patrick felt a joy so profound it almost brought him to his knees. The winter that followed was hard, as winters on the plains always were, but Patrick and Nora weathered it together. They spent long evenings by the fire, Patrick reading aloud from the few books they owned while Nora mended clothes and Sarah worked on her embroidery. They made plans for spring planting, for expanding the farm, for all the years stretched out ahead of them. Sarah met a young farmer from a neighboring homestead during a church social in January, and by March, they were engaged. Patrick walked her down the aisle that spring, feeling oddly paternal toward the young woman who had once pointed a rifle at strangers to protect her home. Her new husband was a good man, hardworking and kind, and Patrick gave them 20 acres of the farm as a wedding present, land he and Nora could spare now that they were prospering. In June, Nora told Patrick she was pregnant. The news filled him with a terror and elation he had never experienced, not even in the worst moments of the war. He was going to be a father. He, who had spent so many years dealing death, was now going to help bring life into the world. "Are you happy?" Nora asked, watching his face carefully. Terrified, Patrick admitted. But yes, happy. Happier than I knew I could be. Their son was born in February of 1878 during a blizzard that buried the farm under 3 feet of snow. Patrick paced the floor of the cabin while Sarah's husband rode through the storm to fetch the midwife. And when he finally heard his son's first cry, he sat down hard on the floor and wept. Nora was exhausted but radiant when he was allowed into the bedroom, and she placed the tiny bundle in his arms with complete trust. Patrick looked down at his son, at the small, perfect face and impossibly tiny fingers, and felt something shift inside him, some final piece of the broken man he had been falling away and leaving only the man he was now. "What should we name him?" Nora asked. Patrick thought of all the men he had known who had not survived the war, all the friends and brothers in arms whose names deserved to be remembered. "James," he said. "James Quinn, after my best friend who died at Shiloh. He saved my life by pushing me out of the way of a cannonball. I always thought I would die with that debt unpaid, but now I can honor his memory by giving his name to our son." "James," Nora repeated, trying it out. "James Quinn, I like it. It is a strong name for what I am sure will be a strong boy." She was right. James grew strong and healthy, a happy baby who rarely cried and seemed to find joy in everything. Patrick was an awkward father at first, terrified of doing something wrong, but Nora guided him with patience and humor until he learned to trust his instincts. He found he loved the simple routines of fatherhood, rocking James to sleep, teaching him to reach for toys, making faces that would coax out a gurgling laugh. The years passed in a sweet blur of hard work and simple pleasures. The farm prospered, and Patrick bought more land, building it into a respectable spread. He became known in Valentine as a fair but formidable man, someone who helped his neighbors when they needed it, but who would not tolerate dishonesty or cruelty. The cold look in his eyes softened, replaced by something warmer, though those who threatened what he loved still saw glimpses of the dangerous man he had once been. Nora gave birth to a daughter in 1880, and they named her Margaret after Nora's mother. She had her mother's dark hair and her father's blue eyes, and from the moment she could crawl, she followed Patrick everywhere like a devoted shadow. He built her a small rocking horse and taught her to ride before she was 3, and Margaret took to it with a fearless enthusiasm that both thrilled and terrified him. Sarah and her husband had 4 children in quick succession, and the 2 families grew close, their children growing up together, the farm's boundaries blurring as they helped each other with planting and harvesting and all the endless work of prairie life. In the summer of 1883, when James was 5 and Margaret was 3, Patrick was working in the barn when a stranger rode up to the farm. Something about the man's bearing made Patrick's hand drift toward his gun, old instincts rising to the surface. But then the man removed his hat, and Patrick recognized him. Daniel Cooper had been in Patrick's company during the war, one of the few who had survived. Patrick had not seen him since 1865, when they had parted ways at a crossroads, both heading in different directions and neither looking back. "Patrick Quinn," Daniel said, dismounting. "I thought that might be you when I heard the name in Valentine. Took me a while to work up the nerve to ride out here and see for sure." Patrick set down the bridle he had been mending and walked forward slowly, studying his old friend. Daniel looked older with gray threading through his hair, but he still had the same steady eyes Patrick remembered. "Daniel." "It has been a long time, nearly 20 years. Daniel glanced around the farm, taking in the neat fields and solid buildings. "Looks like you did all right for yourself. I got lucky." Patrick hesitated, then held out his hand. "It is good to see you." They shook hands and Daniel smiled, something easing in his expression. "I was not sure you would remember me or if you would want to. Last time I saw you, you were in a dark place. We all were, but you especially." "I was," Patrick admitted. "Things are different now." As if summoned by his words, James came running around the corner of the barn, pursued by Margaret, who was shrieking with laughter. They both skidded to a stop when they saw the stranger, James immediately stepping in front of his little sister in a protective gesture that made Patrick's heart swell with pride. "Papa," James said. "Who is this?" Patrick rested his hand on his son's shoulder. "This is an old friend of mine, Daniel Cooper." "Daniel, these are my children, James and Margaret." Daniel's eyebrows rose in surprise. "Children? Well, you really have changed." "Come inside," Patrick said. "My wife will want to meet you, and you can tell me what brings you to Nebraska after all these years." Over coffee at the kitchen table, while Nora entertained the children in the next room, Daniel explained that he had been ranching in Colorado but had decided to move north to be closer to his aging parents in Iowa. He had heard Patrick's name mentioned in Valentine and could not resist the curiosity to see if it was the same man. "I did not think you would survive the war," Daniel said bluntly. "None of us did. You were so angry all the time, so ready to die. After Shiloh, after we lost so many, you were different, harder, like you did not care if you lived or died." "I did not," Patrick said quietly. "Not for a long time after. I drifted for years, doing any work I could find, getting into trouble. I thought that was all I was good for, violence and survival." "What changed?" Patrick glanced toward the next room, where he could hear Nora's voice reading a story to the children. "I met someone who saw past all the anger and hurt to the man I could still be. She saved me, Daniel. Gave me a reason to want to live instead of just surviving." Daniel followed his gaze and nodded slowly. "I am glad for you, Patrick. I really am. We all deserved better than what the war left us with, but so few of us found it. Most of the men I knew from the company are dead now, or drunk, or so broken they might as well be. You are one of the lucky ones." "I know," Patrick said. "Believe me, I know." Daniel stayed for supper and entertained the children with stories of their father as a young soldier, carefully editing out the horror and leaving only the camaraderie and the small moments of humor that had helped them survive. Patrick watched his children's faces light up with fascination, seeing him in a new way, and felt grateful for Daniel's tact. When Daniel left the next morning, heading north to Iowa, Patrick walked him to his horse. "Thank you," he said, "for not telling them the whole truth." "They do not need to know that part," Daniel said. "They just need to know their father is a good man. And you are, Patrick. Whatever you were then, whatever you did, you are a good man now. Do not forget that." After Daniel left, Patrick stood in the yard for a long time, watching the sunrise paint the prairie in shades of gold and rose. He felt Nora's arms slide around him from behind, her cheek pressed against his back. "Are you all right?" she asked. "Yes," Patrick said, and meant it. "I am more than all right. I am home." The years continued to pass, each one bringing its own joys and challenges. The farm grew to 300 acres, a testament to Patrick's skill and Nora's business sense. They weathered droughts and storms, good years and lean ones, always together, always partners in every sense of the word. James grew into a thoughtful boy who loved books as much as horses, and Patrick taught him to ride and shoot, while Nora ensured he received a good education from the schoolteacher in Valentine. Margaret was more adventurous, always climbing trees and exploring the creek, and she had a way with animals that reminded Patrick of his own father. In 1885, Nora gave birth to another son, whom they named Daniel after Patrick's friend. He was a quieter child than his siblings, content to watch and observe, and Patrick saw something of himself in the boy's serious blue eyes. Sarah's family continued to grow as well, and Sunday dinners at one farm or the other became a tradition that Patrick cherished. He loved watching the children run wild across the prairie, loved the sound of their laughter, and the way the two families had woven together into something stronger than either could have been alone. Occasionally, old shadows would surface. Patrick would wake in the night from dreams of Shiloh, of blood and screams and the endless thunder of artillery. But Nora was always there, holding him until the shaking stopped, reminding him that he was safe, that the war was over, that he was no longer that frightened, angry boy. "You saved me," Patrick told her one night after a particularly bad dream, his voice rough with emotion. "I was drowning and you pulled me out." "We saved each other," Nora corrected gently. "I was alone and struggling and you gave me hope. You showed me that strength does not mean hardness, that a man can be both gentle and fierce. You are the best man I know, Patrick Quinn, and I thank God every day that you were foolish enough to spend all your money on a stranger's farm." Patrick smiled against her hair. "Best $500 I ever spent. Only 500. I am insulted. Surely I am worth more than that. Fine. Best $600 I ever spent." Nora's laughter was soft and warm in the darkness, and Patrick held her close, marveling at how far he had come from the man who had ridden into Valentine with a bullet wound and a heart full of ice. In 1890, when James was 12 and already showing signs of becoming a fine young man, Patrick took him on his first cattle drive to Omaha. It was a 2-week journey, and Patrick used the time to teach his son the things a man needed to know: how to read the weather, how to handle difficult cattle, how to treat people with respect regardless of their station in life. Around the campfire one night, James asked the question Patrick had been expecting and dreading. "Papa, Mr. Henderson at the general store said you used to be a gunfighter. Is that true?" Patrick stirred the fire with a stick, watching the sparks rise into the night sky. He had always known this conversation would come, but that did not make it easier. "I was never a gunfighter exactly, but I did kill men, yes, during the war and after." "Why, during the war? Because I was ordered to." "After the war, because I was angry and lost and did not care much about living. I was not a good person then, James. I did things I am not proud of." James was quiet for a long moment, absorbing this. "But you are a good person now." "I try to be." "Your mother helped me see that there was another way to live. She showed me that being strong does not mean being hard, that you can be tough enough to survive without losing your humanity." Patrick looked at his son across the fire. "That is what I want you to learn. Be strong, be brave, stand up for what is right. But never let the world make you cold. Never stop caring about people. That is when you lose yourself." "I understand," James said seriously. "I will try to be like you, Papa, the man you are now, not the man you were before." Patrick felt his throat tighten with emotion. That is all I could ever ask. When Margaret was 7, she asked Patrick to teach her to shoot. He hesitated, remembering all the violence in his past, but Nora encouraged him, pointing out that frontier life was unpredictable, and a girl should know how to protect herself. So Patrick taught Margaret the same way his father had taught him: safety first, respect for the weapon, understanding that a gun was a tool, not a toy. Margaret proved to be a natural shot, with steady hands and a good eye, and Patrick felt an odd mixture of pride and fear watching her hit tin cans off fence posts. "Why do you look so sad, Papa?" Margaret asked one afternoon after practice. Patrick knelt down so he was at her eye level. "Because I know too well what guns can do. I have seen too much death, sweetheart. I want you to be safe, to be able to protect yourself, but I also never want you to have to use these skills." Margaret hugged him fiercely. "I know you worry, Papa. Mama says you have a big heart that feels things deeply, even when you try to hide it. But I promise I will only use what you teach me if I absolutely have to." "That is all I ask," Patrick said, holding his daughter close and thanking God once again for the family he never thought he would have. By 1895, the farm had become one of the most successful in the area. Patrick employed 3 regular hands and took on seasonal workers during planting and harvest. James, now 17, worked alongside his father as an equal, and Patrick had begun teaching him the business side of running a farm, preparing him to take over someday. Margaret, at 12, was a bright, adventurous girl who could ride like the wind and calculate profit margins with equal skill. She talked about going to college someday, about studying agriculture or business, and Patrick encouraged her despite the raised eyebrows from some of the more traditional families in the area. If his daughter wanted to get an education, he would find a way to make it happen. Daniel, at 10, was quieter than his siblings but no less determined. He had a gift for working with animals and spent hours training horses with a patience and understanding that impressed everyone who watched him work. In the summer of that year, on the anniversary of the day Patrick had first ridden into Valentine, Nora organized a party at the farm. Sarah's family came, along with neighbors and friends they had made over the years. There was food and music and dancing, and as Patrick stood on the porch watching his children play with their cousins, he felt a contentment so profound it almost hurt. Nora came to stand beside him, threading her fingers through his. "Happy, more than I can say," Patrick replied. "Sometimes I wonder if I am dreaming, if I will wake up and find myself back in that cold place I lived for so long." "You are not dreaming. This is real. We are real." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "You know what I remember most about the day we met? The look in your eyes. So much pain and loneliness, like you had forgotten what it meant to feel anything good. I wanted to help you, even before I knew you, even when it made no sense. You did help me. You saved me. And you saved me right back. We saved each other, Patrick. That is what love does." As the sun set over the prairie and the party continued around them, Patrick pulled Nora into his arms and kissed her, long and deep, pouring everything he felt into that kiss. When they finally pulled apart, he saw tears in her eyes, but she was smiling. "I love you, Nora Quinn. I will love you until the day I die and beyond. I love you too, Patrick, always and forever." The years that followed were some of the happiest of Patrick's life. James married a sweet girl from Valentine in 1898 and took over the main running of the farm, though Patrick still helped with the work and the decisions. Margaret did go to college, studying at the University of Nebraska in Lincoln, and came back with a degree and ideas for modernizing farm operations that Patrick implemented with enthusiasm. Daniel became a horse trainer of some renown, breeding and training stock that sold across Nebraska and into Wyoming. People came from hundreds of miles away to buy his horses, and Patrick watched with pride as his youngest son built a reputation on skill and integrity. Grandchildren arrived in due course, filling the farm with new life and laughter. Patrick proved to be a doting grandfather, patient and gentle in ways he never would have imagined himself capable of in his younger years. He told the grandchildren stories of the old days, carefully edited, and taught them to ride and fish and appreciate the land that had given their family so much. In 1905, Patrick and Nora celebrated their 28th wedding anniversary with a trip to Omaha, their first real vacation in years. They stayed in a hotel with indoor plumbing and electricity, marveling at how much the world had changed. But after a week, they were both eager to return home, to the farm and the family that was the center of their lives. Patrick was 58 years old then, his hair more gray than brown, his body bearing the marks of decades of hard work. But when he looked at Nora, he still saw the woman he had fallen in love with outside the general store in Valentine, and the way she looked at him told him she felt the same. One evening that fall, sitting on the porch as they had done countless times over the years, Patrick reflected on the strange twists of fate that had brought him to this moment. If he had not been shot by rustlers that day, if he had not stopped to help a stranger, if he had given in to the cold emptiness inside him instead of letting Nora warm the frozen places of his heart, his life would have been so different. He probably would have died in some dusty street, alone and unmourned, just another casualty of the violence that had defined so much of his life. Instead, he had a home, a family, land he loved, and that loved him back. He had become the kind of man his younger self never could have imagined, someone who valued life instead of courting death, who built instead of destroyed. "What are you thinking about?" Nora asked, always attuned to his moods. "How lucky I am," Patrick said simply. "How you took a broken, bitter man and taught him to be whole again. How you softened edges I did not even know I had." "You were never as broken as you thought," Nora replied. "The good man was always there, buried under all that hurt and anger. I just helped you find him again." "You did more than that. You gave me a reason to want to find him." Patrick took her hand, marveling as he always did at how perfectly it fit in his. "I love you, Nora. Thank you for saving me." "And I love you, Patrick. Thank you for letting me." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun set over the prairie, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and red. 3 decades had passed since that day in Valentine, when Patrick Quinn had stepped out of his carefully constructed isolation to help a stranger, and in doing so, had saved himself. The farm would pass to James and his children, and then to their children, a legacy built on love and hard work, and the belief that even the most hardened heart can be softened by compassion. Patrick Quinn, who had once been certain he would die young and unloved, had instead lived to see his family flourish, to know the joy of children and grandchildren, to experience a love so deep and true it had transformed him utterly. He had been hardened by life, shaped by war and loss and all the cruelties the world could inflict. But Nora had softened his edges, had shown him that strength and gentleness could coexist, that it was possible to be both warrior and lover, protector and partner. She had taught him that the past did not have to define the future, that redemption was possible even for those who thought themselves beyond saving. As stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, Patrick thought about all the men he had been: the idealistic boy who went to war, the cold killer who came back, the drifting cowhand who almost gave up on life, and finally, the husband and father and grandfather he had become. All of those men were part of him, but the man he was now, sitting beside his beloved wife and watching the sunset over land they had made prosper together, that was the man he was most proud of. That was the man Nora had helped him become, by believing in him when he had stopped believing in himself, by loving him when he thought himself unlovable, by refusing to let him surrender to the darkness that had nearly consumed him. Patrick Quinn had been hardened by life, yes. But Nora Zimmerman had softened his edges and in doing so, had given him the greatest gift imaginable. A second chance at being human, at being whole, at being loved. And that, he thought as Nora's head came to rest on his shoulder, was worth more than all the money or land or glory in the world. That was what made a life worth living.